So for my talk today, I want to start by telling you a story. I design games, but I also teach game design. And one class I've taught in particular is this grad level game jam a week class. So each week is a different approach to rapid prototyping. Sometimes we do mechanics first, sometimes we start with IP or story first, sometimes it's tech first. All these different ways to just kind of do ideation and get a playable prototype. And it's also a different team every week. So people are working with different teams, different people, different conditions, and everything. And early on, there's always this one week where the theme that I have them do is the approach of design to your team. Um, because if you're say in a game jam and you've got 5 artists and one programmer, you probably want to make a very different kind of game than if you have 4 programmers and one game designer. Um, right. So the design to the team jam is a solo jam. So I tell students, look, you're here. You're in this graduate program in games. You're obviously good at something. Figure out what your strong suit is, and then make a game to showcase that. Have fun with it. Show off. Make a game that makes it obvious what things you're awesome at doing. And this exercise always ends up with some really impressive stuff. Like one student might make a full, well-balanced real-time strategy game in a week. Someone else does a gorgeous visual novel. They're obviously a great artist and story. Everyone in the class feels awful. And it's almost universal in the class. Like everyone feels bad in a low key sense that just everyone is convinced that they're in the bottom half of the class. They're wondering if they're here because the admissions department made a terrible mistake. They see all the amazing stuff their classmates are doing, and each student feels like they're the only one here who really just can't cut it. They're all terrified that they don't belong here and that the only thing they're going to do while they're here as a grad student is to drag their current and future teams down with them. And they're just everyone feels bad after these amazing demos. And at that moment, I ask them to look away from me and look away from the screen and just look into each other's eyes. At least when this is live in a classroom, though, you can do this with webcams on Zoom too. Just have everyone stare into the camera. Um, and this magical thing happens where I go ahead and say this part out loud. Because every student at this point is suffering in silence. They think that it's just them. They're the only ones that feel this way about their work. And when I mention that it's actually everyone, and they look around the room and they see that spark of recognition in each other's eyes, and they realize that they aren't alone. It's not just them feeling this way. It's everyone. And at first, they go through these 3 stages, right? First, there's disbelief. It's like, wait, you, the kid with the most amazing project ever, you feel this way too? How is that possible? Um, and then they go from disbelief to relief. Like, wait, this isn't just me. This is really just a thing. It's hitting all of us. I'm in good company. This is great. And then it suddenly shifts to confusion. Like, wait a minute, why are we all suffering from the exact same delusion? Like, Ian, what did you do to us? Um, and so, as I said, I'm a game designer, and I'm specifically a systems designer. And one of the things to know about systems designers is we naturally notice patterns. Patterns in gameplay, patterns in mechanics, but also patterns in the world in general. And so when I started to notice that this thing was a pattern in this class, I started to get a bit more proactive about it. And I would start by lecturing the class early on and with me showing them this graph right here and asking, has anyone seen this before? Now, I'm guessing many of you have seen this before, but I assure you that at the student level and even grad students, most of them haven't. I mean, obviously, everyone can realize this is a mathematical function of some kind, but most of my students wouldn't recognize this by sight. Um, but this is a very important curve, not just in game development, but in life in general. And this curve is the reason why everyone feels so bad when they see each other's best work. But before I get into this function and why it's important, I'm going to tell you another story. And the story starts with this guy. I don't know his name. His name really isn't important. But in 1995, he decided he was going to go rob a bank. That was going to be his way to get income. This is a shot of him on a bank security camera when he's in the middle of robbing that bank. You'll notice he has, it's a little blurry, but he does have a gun. But you'll also notice he's not wearing any kind of disguise. He has no ski mask or anything. You can clearly see his face and his whole body. And that's what he did. He just walked right into the bank, held up the teller, smiled and waved to the security cameras on the way out. Later that day, he was kind of surprised when the cops paid a visit to his home. But his real surprise came at his criminal trial, where the prosecution brought in the video of him on camera robbing the bank. And when he saw this tape that was used as evidence against him in his own crime, he could not believe it. And he was heard reportedly to say over and over, "But I don't understand. I wore the juice. I wore the juice." He actually said, "I wore the juice. I wore the juice." What? Um, so what's the story behind that? Well, this criminal genius had learned at some point that you could make invisible ink using lemon juice. And this is true. Many of us probably did this as kids, right? You just brush lemon juice on plain white paper and you wait for it to dry, and it just looks like normal paper. And it only reveals its message if you move it near a heat source, like an open flame or something. And this guy apparently thought that invisible ink worked the way it does in cartoons, where it actually made things invisible. That somehow this meant he would not show up on security cameras. Um, oops, right? So he's basically going to do jail time because he got cartoon physics and real world physics mixed up. Um, Now, most of us would just read this story and laugh, right? It's like we all love stupid criminal stories because it makes us feel better about ourselves. But these two people, David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger, looked at the story and they have a different thought. They didn't just laugh. They said, they were like true scientists. They said, that's interesting. Why? Like, sure, okay, this guy's not exactly the brightest bulb in the circuit, but surely he must have known he wasn't that bright, right? And maybe it might have occurred to him, it's like, maybe I'm not the criminal genius that I think I am. I'm just not that bright a guy. Maybe I should find a friend of mine that's a little bit smarter than me and ask about this cunning plan of mine before I put it all on the line. But he didn't, right? He didn't. He just went in, completely confident, even though he was just obviously not all there. And it's like, why? Why didn't he recognize his own incompetence? And so these people designed a series of experiments that showed that actually this phenomenon of thinking that you're smarter or more talented than you are is not just reserved for bank robbers. There's a little lemon juice wearer, in all of us. For example, if you ask a random room full of people who know how to drive, who thinks you're above average in driving? Like, you don't have to be expert. You're not talking about like NASCAR level, race drivers, just in the top half, better than half of the other people on the road. Um, about 70% of people will say they are above average. Now, obviously, this is mathematically impossible. 50% of people are above the median. That's how it works, not 70%. Which means that if 70% of people think they are above the median, at least 20% of them are wrong. And it gets worse. You might think, okay, maybe it's just the people hovering in the middle in the 50%. If you're at 49th percentile and you think you're at 51st percentile, that would be understandable, right? But no, that's not actually what happens. What you actually see is that the people who are at the very bottom of the curve, the ones who are really a true menace on the road, the ones that are probably going to get themselves and someone else killed someday, those are the people who think they're great drivers. Um, and it's actually not just 20% of the people who are wrong. It's more than that because there's also people at the high end, people who are legitimately really, really good drivers who also get this wrong and say that they are a below average, even though they're really not. And we actually see this with most things. Sure, most people who aren't neurosurgeons aren't going to say they're above average in neurosurgery, but if you ask a room full of professional neurosurgeons, how many of you are above average within your field? Yeah, most of them are going to say they're better than their colleagues. Ask a computer programmer, are they above average at programming among all programmers? Most of them are going to say yes. And I can tell you from my experience in my own field of game design, everyone thinks they'd make a great game designer, except for the really great game designers who are universally convinced that they suck at game design. So that brings us back to this graph. Now, this is called the Dunning-Kruger curve, named after the researchers who described it. And at this point, usually some people in my class have heard the name before, and now they recognize this, but most others haven't. So this is where I label the axes of this graph. And this is where the important part is. So on the x-axis of this graph, we have skill or competence, like how good you actually really are at a particular task. And on the y-axis, we have how good you think you are at it. The dotted line here, the y equals x, is where you would be if your self-assessment was always accurate. If at every point you could correctly judge how good you were. And the solid line, the really curvy one that goes up, then down, then up again, that's how people actually judge themselves. So you can see that we are usually way, way off in our self-assessment. We are just not very good at this whole judge yourself task. And so it's worth asking, well, why? What's going on here? Why do we suck so badly at correctly figuring out how good we are at something? So here's the basic principle at work, that the skills you use to perform a task are actually the same skills it takes to accurately judge how good someone is at that task. So if you're an expert at something, say you're an expert at programming, and I gave you a bunch of code samples, and I told you some of these code samples were written by beginners, and others are by experienced, talented people who are very good at programming. An expert programmer would be able to tell the difference very quickly. It's like, well, this piece of code has an obvious bug. That was written by a newbie. This person uses the name loop iterator for their loop instead of I. Okay, they're just learning. Ooh, this person's doing some really interesting, pointer arithmetic, and they're doing it competently, and they're doing it with an interesting code optimization. Ooh, this one's writing beautiful code in a consistent style, right? An expert programmer is going to be able to instantly see those differences and be able to tell the expert code from the beginner code. A beginning programmer, on the other hand, they wouldn't notice these things. They just see this is code, this is code, this is more code. They don't have enough experience to know what good code or bad code looks like, so they won't recognize it, and they'll have some very flawed reasoning about why some things look better than others to them. So we can't judge other people's skill at a task unless we are skilled ourselves, which means that if we're not very good at a task, we're not going to be good at judging ourselves either. So that brings us to the bottom part of this curve. So we'd expect people at the lower end of the curve to be wildly wrong in their self-assessment because they just don't have the skills to be able to know how good they are. Um, why do we see them? Why do they see themselves as much better and not much worse than they are? Partly it's because if you suck at something, and you have to be off in one direction or the other, there's only so much you can do to underestimate. But mostly it's because of self-serving bias. We all see ourselves as the protagonist in our own story. We like to think of ourselves as the good guys. If we're going to err, we're going to err on the side of guessing that we're accidentally awesome. It's one of those tricks our minds play on us to make our lives bearable. The peak of this curve has a name, by the way. This is a technical term. Um, so in the second phase, after we climb Mount Stupid, the person that's learning a skill is starting to actually get a little bit good at it, which means you're able to see for the first time the flaws in your own work, right? You've scaled this mountain of aptitude. You've reached the top, the peak of what you think the skills needed for this field are, and you realize there's a whole other mountain off in the distance that's higher than this one that you never there. And by the way, this never goes away. There's always more to learn in each field. Every time you reach what you think is mastery, you will suddenly see the next thing to master, and you'll feel stupid and insignificant and powerless all over again. Just like it's turtles all the way down, right? It is mountain peaks all the way up. And because of this, we tend to overshoot and assume that because we are good enough to see all our flaws and all the things that we can't do, that we just absolutely totally suck at this thing. And this area below the curve on the right half of the graph, this also has a name. It's called imposter syndrome. Maybe you've heard that term before. It's the feeling that everyone else seems to treat you like you are actually competent, but you secretly know that you actually suck. You're a fraud, you're a total fake, you have no skill, you're bad at what you do, and it's only a matter of time before someone comes in and points at you and says, "Hey, you're a fraud, you know nothing." And your only response will be to throw up your hands and say, "Yep, you got me. You're totally right. I was wondering how many years it would take for someone to finally realize it." So here we are with entire room full of students where everyone has some strengths and some weaknesses. Everyone has done amazing work. Some are expert programmers, but they couldn't draw a simple stick figure to save their lives. Some are great artists thinking, sure, I made some pretty pictures, but I have no idea how to make a game fun at all. I don't know any game design. Then we got the game designers who have games that are actually fun to play, and they're thinking, well, yeah, my game is fun, but it's just this dinky little silly thing. It had to be because we couldn't do any better with programming. Um, right. So everyone's looking at other people's work and saying that's better than mine in some way. Therefore, I suck. So what's really happening is there's an entire classroom filled with people who are all good enough at their core skill set to be convinced that they suck. And they've all seen others here who are better at other skill sets, maybe even better at their own core skill set, which just confirms how below the curve they are inside their own heads. And that's why everyone in my class feels just kind of awful, and probably has ever since they first attended orientation at the school. I'll also point out this isn't just a single curve that any of us faces. We're all somewhere along this curve in all of our skills. Some skills were on the left side, some were on the right. So most of my students are going to be convinced that they're worthless, and what I'm showing here is mathematical, scientific evidence that they are wrong, that they're not as bad as they're afraid they might be. But remember, we also have some skills where we're climbing Mount Stupid, so remember that while you're not as bad as you think you are, you're also probably not as good as you think you are either. Now you'll notice on the right side of the curve, it never got quite back up to reality. The highest experts in the field still think they're worse than they actually are. I can say that this is true from my perspective in my field of game design. I know a lot of professional game designers. I even know a few professional game designers that are like the kinds of game designers that other designers look up to as a designer's designer. Every single professional game designer I know has imposter syndrome really bad. Zero exceptions, every single one. I have had private conversations with people where I have had to convince a colleague that they didn't suck as badly as they think they do, more times and with more people than you could possibly imagine. And I do include myself in this. I feel this too. Artists and writers do this too, almost universally. Most creative fields. I've lost count of the times I've had an artist friend show me some new piece that they did, like here's a drawing, and I'm looking at their drawing, and my first thought is, if you gave me 20 years to practice, I could not create something that looks that good. This is so far beyond my own ability. I can't even conceptualize how good you are at making art. And before I can say that, they introduce their work and they say, so this is my latest work. I know it sucks and it's terrible and I'm a bad artist. And I'm just like, how do you ever think that? Um, I love this quote from Neil Gaiman. If you haven't read through it all, you can find it online or you can just look through I think this thing's being recorded. I'll post the slides later too. You can read it. It's great. Um, Programmers, I would say, get this a little less than everyone else just because we do have some pretty good benchmarks for that. There are some websites you can go where it'll give you like a series of short programming tasks and you can do them and it'll take metrics on whether your code runs correctly on some test data sets and how fast you wrote it and whether that compares with thousands of other people. So you can actually get a pretty good idea of where you stand relative to other people. But even then, it's still common to suck at self-assessment as a programmer. Not everyone takes those tests. Even if you do, your brain has a strong incentive to lie to you and tell you, oh, disregard those results. I think you're way better or worse than what those results say. Maybe it was just a skewed sample. So now you might be wondering, okay, well, what do we do about this? Is this just a curse on all game designers? Is this just going to plague you to the end of your days until you finally breathe your last breath? Are we all destined to feel insignificant and meaningless and terrible at our jobs and think that we're a bad human being forever? So yes, I do have some advice to share about how to make this feel slightly better. The first part is just knowing that it exists, knowing that there are names for it, like the Dunning-Kruger effect and imposter syndrome. Just knowing that your feelings are so common that there's a name sometimes helps you to question yourself, to take a step back. So when your brain is beating you up, you can say, all right, maybe there's at least a possibility here that I'm being unfair to myself. Maybe I really suck. Maybe this is just imposter syndrome. And sometimes that seed of doubt is enough. And that's why I give a lecture about this topic to every game dev class I have. It's why I give talks like this, one that I'm giving now, at every opportunity I can, because this effect just feels way worse when you don't know that it's a thing and you think it's just you. Another thing I found that helps is doing downward mentoring. Find someone who knows less than you and wants to make games. This is pretty easy for my grad students. All they have to do is hang out in the labs and wait for some first or second year undergrad to bang their head into the computer in frustration. If you have at least some experience making games and you're dealing with someone who's just beginning their journey, their questions are going to be pretty basic. And you've seen the same thing a dozen times before yourself, so you know the answer just off the top of your head. And sure, your brain will tell you, oh, that doesn't mean anything. They're just new at this. It certainly doesn't mean I'm good at what I do. They just asked me a basic question that any idiot could answer. I just happened to be the idiot who was there at the time. But then every now and then something will happen. Like this new person will ask you a question, you'll give them the obvious answer, and then they'll look at you like you just totally blew their mind. Like if you're in a group setting, like a computer lab or something, maybe some other people overheard, and they'll also stare at you like you're some kind of like freaking Gandalf or something. With all your advanced arcane knowledge, and it'll possibly occur to you that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a basic question. It was a basic question for you because you're actually somewhat good at this stuff, but it wasn't basic for them or for anyone else because clearly this isn't a skill that everyone's naturally born with. You might have forgotten that there used to be a time when you didn't know this thing yourself because it's second nature to you now. But seeing others who don't know it, maybe you'll start to remember and you'll start to see just how far you've come on your own personal journey. This is not a permanent cure, but I found that at least for me, it helps a lot. I do a lot of mentoring. And this is something that you can do pretty much throughout all stages of your career, right? If you're a college student, you can mentor grade school kids. After you graduate, you can mentor college students in your local area. At most major conferences, there are opportunities to sign up as a volunteer to mentor others. Lots of Facebook groups and Discord chats and other groups have like some kind of mentor-mentee matchmaking that you can sign up for, where you give it your expertise and it'll match you with someone who has questions about the thing you're good at. Oh, um, is there someone else out there that needs to mute themselves? I'm getting some feedback. There's there's even a women in games jam going on right now where each team is assigned an industry mentor. So when you're finding that you can actually be helpful as a mentor to someone, yeah, I definitely recommend doing this. It helps with your imposter syndrome, and as a side benefit, it also helps the people that you're mentoring, so you don't even have to feel selfish or guilty about it. By the way, mentoring goes both ways. If you can find someone else as a mentor for you, and there are lots of places that do automated matchmaking between mentors and mentees and stuff like that, it can really help if there's someone who's definitely in a class above you that can remind you that they feel this too, and that they can give you an honest assessment of your skills from someone who you know has the competence to be able to see your level of skill. And you have to remind yourself that if you trust this mentor to be good at what they do, at least better than you are, enough that they can mentor you in the first place, then maybe you should trust their assessment of your skill. Um, every now and then, stretch outside your comfort zone. Challenge yourself to do something that stretches your skill set a little. Doesn't have to be totally outside your domain. Like, if I'm a game designer, doesn't mean I have to start doing 3D art, right? But maybe like work in a genre that I'm unfamiliar with or something like that. Just something that's difficult but achievable, right? This will help reinforce your confidence in your abilities, and as a side benefit, you widen your skills and actually get better at what you do too. And last piece of advice I have is keep in touch with your professional network. Cultivate a group of friends, especially the kind that are honest and will tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. And you need to be open to hearing that. If you're really feeling like you're at the edge of a cliff and that like you are just at the end of your rope and you just cannot take it anymore, that you're convinced that your work is horrible, just it's good to have some people that you can just send a quick private message to and just ask to chat for a few minutes, show them your work, and know that if they say it's good, that they aren't just being nice. They really mean it because they're not the kind of person who would just give you false hope. This can help a lot if you have the kinds of friends you can reach out to who can remind you that you're actually good at what you do. And even if you don't always even have to exercise this option very often, just knowing that it's there can be a comfort. Like, knowing this, like, I know this person, we go way back, and before I even call them, I know exactly what they're going to say. And I can just hear their voice in my head telling me that I don't suck. And I know they'd be right, and I know that I respect their professional opinion. I know they'd be right, and I don't even have to call them. I know they're just like this. It's just like having this other voice in your head telling you that your work is good, to kind of offset or counterbalance like the voice of yours in your own head telling you that you suck. Those people in your network are worth gold. Keep them around and try to be the kind of person who can also be there in this capacity for others. The better you are at convincing other people about their own imposter syndrome, the more tools you'll have to do this for yourself. Um, I can also say, if you can, take these people that are your peers and do a passion project with them every now and then, even if it's just like a game jam or something once in a while. Game jams are great for this kind of thing when you're doing this with colleagues. It puts everyone's imposter syndrome way out in the open for all of you because we all deal with this and you can all have a frank discussion about that. And lastly, just practice some self-compassion, right? Be as compassionate and empathetic and understanding of yourself as you would be towards someone else if they were telling you these things. So that's my advice. None of these things are perfect. I mean, as far as I know, there's no 100% cure. There's no vaccine for imposter syndrome. But at least these are the strategies I've used myself, and sometimes they help me a lot. They don't make things perfect, but they take the edge off so that life can be bearable again. And that's the best I can do.